First of all, women, it is not new that women are victims of sexual violence in the mark of the conflict in Colombia. This has been occurring forever, for ages. In 2005, there was an agreement between the government and the paramilitary organizations, which was called the Justice and Peace Process. And some of the decisions, some of the sentences that were handed down by the courts in the context of the Justice and Peace Process were explicitly on sexual violence carried out in the mark of the conflict. It was quite apparent from the testimony that was provided that the use of sexual violence was a systematic tool of war used by the paramilitary organizations. But between these, between the beginning of the Justice and Peace Process and the first sentence that was handed down for sexual violence in the context of the conflict, 10 years passed. The wheels of justice moved very, very slowly. This lesson was learned, and in the peace process with the negotiation with the FARC, women's movements insisted that sexual violence should be included in the agreement. It was a late add-on in the negotiation with the paramilitaries, and so it was a clear conclusion of the women's movement that it should be included in the peace process with the negotiation with the FARC. We argued that female victims should be in the center of the process. They shouldn't be marginal to the agreement, but they should be recognized as being central victims of the conflict. We felt that it was, as I say, extremely important that women were not seen as peripheral to the conflict, but as a central target of the armed groups. There are 122 gender measures within the peace agreement in recognition of this work that the women's movement did. They're not being implemented properly, but at least in the letter of the peace agreement, we were successful in getting a gender perspective and recognition of gender-based violence against women in the context of violence recognized within the agreement. One of the most serious obstacles faced by women in this context is that they have been, and that has helped to silence them for many, many years, is the sense of guilt that is imposed on women. Women feel guilty if they're victims of sexual violence, and that has been a big barrier to achieving justice. There's an accusation that is generally accepted by our machista society that women make up stories of sexual violence. The experience of women who seek to speak out and to seek justice makes it clear that they are marginalized and silenced by these social aspects and these cultural aspects. And the guilt that they have felt traditionally as a part of the culture is not handed over to the victims. It should be that there should be a transformation so that the guilt that they feel for being victims is actually felt by the people who have victimized them. It's a long process. It's also important to recognize that society recognizes that sexual violence was carried out for many reasons. It was a way in which the armed groups, armed actors, sought to control the societies that they were operating in, control the communities. It's particularly apparent or eloquent in the testimonies of the women that they have been used in order to assert the power of the armed groups. In many scenarios in Colombia, children are expected or grow up expecting to be converted into victims of violence in the areas of conflict. The presence of armed men taken alongside the absence of the state is dangerous to women, is dangerous to girls. This is one of the principal conclusions that the testimonies that we have taken make very, very clear. And particularly vulnerable are indigenous and Afro-descendant women. The Afro women have been very have been clear that the violence which they have been subjected to by armed groups is a repetition, a continuation of a cycle of violence that they have been victims of since the early days of the existence of their presence in the country. And that the role of the state has done absolutely nothing to counter these um, actions. So the women, black and indigenous women, have brought their ancestral knowledge, their ancestral understanding of gender-based violence to the way that they experience the violence that has been imposed on them during the more recent conflicts. And this historical experience of gender-based violence is also must be understood as a part of the way in which women have experienced the sexual violence that they have been victims of. And this is why it is so important for these communities that non-repetition is emphasized. But it's not just the recent conflict, it's their historical experience that needs to be repaired. I think it's very important that society understands the prevalence of gender-based violence, of sexual violence. Our society needs to recognize it and recognize that many of the practices are rooted, that these practices are rooted in the patriarchal system that characterizes Colombian society. First, the report on violence against women should explicitly take note of the stories told by the women in order to ensure that its conclusions reflect the lived and historical realities of women. Second, the report should identify patterns that are not so much quantitative patterns, but qualitative. What kind of actions of violence have women been victims of? That demonstrates, that takes note of how long these practices have been carried out, and that recognize the similarity between modern expressions and past expressions of gender-based violence against women. And it's important that the standards that are applied within the process are directed towards integral reparation for the women who have been victims of sexual violence in the context of the conflict. So the attempts to uncover the truth must be rooted, as we say, in these historical realities and actually listen to the voice of the women who have been victims of sexual violence. We are very concerned that the regime is not interested. We don't know who is behind, who is responsible for the response to sexual violence against women in the context. The authorities are entirely unserious in their response to this question. And it's important that there is an understanding that the Truth Commission helps to clarify the way in which strategies of the use of sexual violence against women operates to the benefit of their interests, of the interests of the armed actors, the way they use sexual violence to advance their aims. And it also is important to recognize with a gender perspective that sexual violence is also institutionalized violence, that the institutions also operate in ways which are anti-women and violate the rights of women and the bodies of women, so that all Colombians, men and women, become aware as a result of this process of the patterns of violence against women and the vulnerability that women face in the way in which, according to the way in which society is currently organized. And finally, I want to stress that we insist that the special jurisdiction for peace should should name a public prosecutor, a national level public prosecutor specialized in violence against women. Obviously, this should be a woman. The HEP doesn't have that at the moment, and it's very important that they do have a specialist prosecutor to deal with violence against women. This is a principal demand that we're making. At the moment, there is not an adequate reparation model for women who've been victims of sexual and violence within the context, and it's absolutely vital that one should be established.